everyone. Welcome again to A Second Look. This is Neil Earle. Glad to be with you with a guest tonight. Should be a very interesting show. Beautiful November weather out there. Tonight we are poised between two great American holidays, Veterans Day last week and Turkey Day coming up next week, the great holiday of Thanksgiving. It's becoming clear as I live longer and longer in this country that America needs to do more than just honor its veterans. It needs to do a lot more for them. This came home to my attention last week at Citrus College. One of our faculty members hosted a special ceremony for veterans, and some of the statistics are not very good. 1 in 3 homeless people are veterans. 200,000 disabled veterans do not get any kind of assistance at all with some of their injuries, which are very severe. So tonight I thought, what a good opportunity to go back and tell a little bit of the story of our veterans, talking about something that really intrigued our history class at Citrus College, the Korean War. It's been called the Unknown War. Actually, there's a book of this title that I picked up in Canada several years, actually 15 years ago now. The Unknown War, sometimes called the Forgotten War as well. And to help us remember, to pay respect to our veterans, and to help us be thankful for them, I've asked Pastor Miles Johnson to come along tonight to share some of his memories. He is a veteran of the Korean War. Welcome to this show, Miles.
Thank you. Glad to be here.
And you're no stranger to Duarte, right?
No. I got to work in the Route 66 parade.
Yes, that was a couple of years ago.
Yes.
You actually helped sponsor a booth where you were giving away some literature on the subject of reconciliation. Maybe we can do some reconciling of the generations here tonight. So we're glad to have you. I know you know this area very well. Now, you, of course, I know a little bit that you're from Oklahoma, so it's not unusual for an Oklahoma boy to end up in California, but we do like to know a little bit about our guests, so tell us how you got started.
All right. I was born in Oklahoma, but my family moved up to Wichita, Kansas. My dad worked in the machine shop, and from there I waited until I was 17 to join the service, and they had me make sure I got my birth certificate because they didn't believe I was 17, but my parents did sign, and I joined the Navy. And right
all the way from Kansas.
All the way from the Kansas, and we rode a train right out here to San Diego. And for San Diego, I went through the boot camp there.
You're repeating the journey so many hundreds of thousands made before you.
Right. And from whenever we finished boot camp, then they assigned me to the aircraft carrier, USS Valley Forge.
Which we'll be talking about later. So like so many people in the middle of the country, you fell in love with California, obviously.
Obviously.
So I know you ended up working for California Edison.
Yes.
For quite a few years. Is your wife from California?
She was originally born in Oregon, but her family moved here because of work, so that they could find work. And this is where she grew up.
And so you've raised a family right here in the Los Angeles area?
Right here in the Los Angeles area.
3 children, 2 girls, 1 boy?
1 girl and 2 boys.
1 girl, 2 boys. You mentioned that you're only 17. This was, I think we talked earlier, it was 1949 when you joined the Navy. We tried to get the village people in the Navy. We couldn't find it in time. But you were just about in time for the Korean War, so that's what we want to talk about a little bit later here tonight. So what we're going to do first, before Miles tells us some of his experiences sloshing around on that big ship, the aircraft carrier Valley Forge, with about 3,000 other U.S. seamen, we're going to talk a little bit and sketch the background to the Korean War, which is absolutely fascinating. David Halberstam wrote a book in which he called the Korean War a war full of drama and pathos, and that is no exception. Let's just, for the benefit of our viewers and those who may be joining us later on here, just look back a little bit about what was going on. It was in June 1950, and we'll have some pictures to help out tell the story here. It was in June 1950 when about 90,000 North Korean communist soldiers crossed the border into U.S.-backed South Korea. After World War II, North and South Korea were divided like so many countries, and we have a map that will show you the strategic importance of Korea. Indeed, as time goes on, historians find out more and more that the Korean War was all about protecting Japan, and I think one of our first pictures will show the Korean Peninsula in relationship to the Sea of Japan, where Miles was there, to the right of Korea. And Japan, of course, is the absolutely vital piece of strategic real estate, you might call it. The United States must secure in Asia, of course, American lives, so many costly lives in World War II, to take Okinawa and Japan. And in 1950, communist forces came pouring across the 38th parallel. We're still not sure. There's so much about the Korean War that's still a mystery. We know that the communist leader, who's I think the father of the present leader, the man there then, it was Kim Il-sung, we know he checked it out with Joseph Stalin. And in 1950, of course, the whole United States and the whole Western world were very much involved in the battle against communism. The Cold War was on. The U.S. had just built up Europe, the Marshall Plan, the Truman Doctrine, NATO, the North Atlantic. Pay attention, Citrus College students. NATO is bound to be on the final exam again this year. The North Atlantic Treaty, that secured Europe. But here, where nobody expected it, in this beautiful land of Korea, major war breaking out. What does Harry Truman do? Well, he feels right away this is probably part of the communist master plan. It wasn't really out of sorts to think that way back then. And so the United States got involved in the war, sent what help it could from Japan. Again, you'll see from the map how closely tied in the U.S. Army of Occupation was in Japan. But, of course, things did not go very well at first. The North Koreans had the initiative. They had a lot of those T-34 Soviet tanks, which were the best tanks in the world at the time. And the United Nations forces found themselves pushed back. I think we can show that map of the Korean Peninsula again, where you'll see the very southern tip of what they call the Pusan perimeter. The very southern tip of Korea was where the Allied forces were pushed back. However, General MacArthur was in Japan. He was in charge of what was then a United Nations effort. 12,000 British, 3,000 Canadians, 5,000 Turks, 5,000 others, even from the Philippines, fighting there. MacArthur made the brilliant landing behind the North Korean lines, not far from Seoul, the capital of South Korea, and immediately turned the tide of battle. And then, as we will show you again, the map's worth having another look at. This is the pathos and the heartbreak of the Korean War. Once this North Korean army was completely captured or surrounded between the forces of MacArthur, now at the 38th parallel, and the UN forces pushing up from the south. Big decision. Would the UN forces cross the 38th parallel? One reason Korea has been so significant is that in the Persian Gulf War, the U.S. decided not to go to Baghdad, and we won't get into that because that's got ominous overtones for even what's going on today. But there's the 38th parallel, right smack dab in the middle of the country. MacArthur decides to push on. Truman's a little bit reluctant. The chiefs of staff in Washington are a little bit leery about it. And MacArthur pushing right up to the Chinese border. And we have a picture of that as well, showing where the next great dramatic event, first was the invasion, second was the counterattack by the UN, and right up against the Chinese border, the Yalu River, is where the UN forces were about November 1950, 56 years ago this month, when 200, we're not exactly sure, I've heard many different numbers, 200 to 300,000 Chinese volunteers, they were called, came streaming across the border, and all of a sudden, as MacArthur said, it was a very different war. And here are the United States Marines, for the first time in their history, retreating from North Korea, reeling in some ways from that massive Chinese offensive. It's winter, it's freezing, you'd remember that, Miles, it gets pretty cold over there. Coming back from the Chosin area, they call it frozen chosen. Any Korean soldiers who were there will never forget the 1st Marine Division fighting, surrounded on 3 fronts. There's a famous line. One reporter said, "Well, I thought the Marines never retreated." And an old sergeant said, "Retreat, hell, we're advancing in a different direction." They're coming back, I guess, to be disembarked by the Navy, right? The Navy was there to pull out the Marines. Harry Truman said the best Christmas present he ever had was the 1st Marine Division being extricated from North Korea. MacArthur is sort of flabbergasted, and after many other incidents, another great dramatic incident, Truman fires MacArthur. Americans of that time will never forget it. And in comes General Ridgway. I think we even have a picture of General Matthew Ridgway and his aide-de-camp. And Ridgway, much more flamboyant than MacArthur, but very competent, decides to use the artillery to the sort of a hedgehog, I hope that's the right phrase, a kind of a hedgehog defense. Take the higher ground. The communists like the higher ground. We'll take the higher ground. We'll use our artillery. The communists like to attack at night with the bugles blaring and all of this. And Ridgway said, we'll use our airplanes and we'll drop flares. That will sort of change the tide of battle, and it does. And in 1953, the Chinese lose about 100,000 soldiers thanks to Ridgway's superb generalship, hard fighting by the soldiers of the Allies. And there we are. And Stalin dies, and we don't know how much involved he was, but the Koreans then begin to talk about an armistice, and to this very day, there we are staring at each other, Americans and North Koreans, Americans and South Koreans staring across the 38th parallel, one of the most dramatic, bitter, controversial, up and down wars ever fought. And Miles was there, safely, at least in his aircraft carrier, right? So what comes to mind when you hear that rapid fire, as it was, repeating of the Korean story?
Well, I got in right on the first part of it. Like I said, I was on board the aircraft carrier Valley Forge, and we were set to do a world tour, a goodwill tour, after World War II. And we were starting off to go all the way around the world. We started off, the first place
I think we got a picture of the valley. Yeah, there she is. Beautiful.
The first place we went was Hawaii, and then to the Philippines, then to Hong Kong, China. And while we were tied up in Hong Kong, China, the war broke out. And that's ended our world tour. So we turned right around and headed up for the 38th parallel.
Oh, yes. And who's that handsome, young, dashing sailor whose picture we just had up there?
And that was a long time ago.
A long time ago.
17 there.
17, man. They just didn't mind taking them young.
Right. So we headed right up for the 38th parallel, and we had our prop aircraft, and they sent them off to bomb and strafe in North Korea, and help them move the Koreans out of the south part.
Thankfully, in the Korean War, we had total naval superiority, right? Which was...
Well, when we got there, we spent the first couple of days in the general quarters. Then they said, well, we're going to have to relax that a little bit because you couldn't do nothing.
What's general quarters?
General quarters was all hands at their battle stations.
Oh.
So then they would send off our aircraft over to bomb and strafe. And in one of the turrets, they had a movie camera.
Oh, yeah.
And they told them to particularly hit these trailers with hay on them.
Huh.
And they said that they come to find out that the North Koreans were bringing their ammunitions down under cover of a load of hay. And so they would bomb and strafe it, and then the next thing you know, it would blow up and almost get the airplane. But then they would show us at night. They would show us what they had done, and it was very interesting. You know, they showed us that they were making progress in driving the North Koreans back.
This was the first counteroffensive,
First
right?
counteroffense.
Going
We
back
were the
up,
first
going
one
back
on
up
the
the
line.
peninsula. Right.
We were first one on the line, and then they wanted to convert to jet aircraft, and that became a real problem because all the catapults and everything that took care of and made sure that they got off in a strong fashion weren't strong enough to push a jet off fast enough to get him airborne.
It's a totally, yeah, it's a different ball game altogether,
Different
right?
ball game.
You go from prop planes, as you said.
Consequently, we lost a few jets whenever they first began to experiment with that.
Of course, that's another thing about the Korean War. There's so much significance because the Korean War is the first time the jet really...
Right. That's whenever it started coming in, right there.
You had the MiGs, what they call the Yalu River became known as MiG Alley, where the Russians were flying. And another thing that's come out over the years is that it's the only time we know of that Russians and Americans were actually firing at each other during the Cold War was the air war.
Right.
And you guys, it's just incredible then how big those aircraft carriers are, that they could go from prop planes to jet planes.
Right.
Without a lot of difficulty, you might say.
The big thing was getting the carrier off and coming into the wind.
Can you explain that?
Going full force with the propellers.
Why would aircraft carriers, and it's such a dramatic phrase, turning into the wind. Why would aircraft carriers do that, turn into the wind?
Well, we needed more wind for the jets, okay? Now,
to lift up
and get the jet airborne.
Okay.
Okay, with the prop, you could actually be sitting still and put enough power in the catapult and blast him off and he'd take off. But you couldn't do that with a jet. I mean, you had to really we would go full speed, 40 knots, right into the wind, and then it was very...
the theory of aerodynamics, I guess, is the wind lifts up the wings, and that's what...
But they did a lot of experimenting, and they finally got it down.
The song comes from, "You're the wind beneath my wings."
Right.
Okay.
And it was amazing to watch.
Oh yeah.
It was amazing to watch.
What would you do? General 8-hour shifts round the clock?
Right. At first, that's what we did. Then they were able to relax a little bit because we found that there was no one bothering us. No aircraft was coming around us. We did get a call from a submarine, but they backed off and we never heard any more from them. Yeah. And so they relaxed on our general quarters, which was All Hands Battle Station, and we went into a routine on and off watch. Yeah. And so we would be on 4 hours and off 8. We had enough people to do that, plus the fact that they brought in the reserves, and as the war continued on. It was
absolutely crucial in the Navy's role, because we usually, when we think of Korea, like I said, it's the 8th Army retreating, the 1st Marines Division fighting surrounded on 3 sides. But the Navy, thank God we had total naval superiority, because you were doing a lot of shelling too, right?
Right. And it was amazing to see what the planes were picking up whenever they were going over there. I mean, they were really doing damage, and it ended up really helping the war effort.
Oh yeah, that was the whole point about even in the MacArthur phase, being able to go up the peninsula because of almost total air superiority, and then when the MiGs came in. Interesting story you tell about you and your brother being able to serve on the same aircraft carrier. Now this may be a secret that the Navy doesn't know about yet, but why don't you fill us in on that?
Well, my father was married before he married my mother, and whenever they divorced, his wife took her maiden name back again. She took the boy, and I grew up with him but I knew him, and his name was Robinson, and mine was Johnson, and him and I were in the Navy at the same time, and he called me up one day and said he had been transferred to a new ship. Could I see if I could transfer? And we transferred. I put in the transfer, and I got on the same ship, and we both went to Korea together then. And he was an aerographer, which sends up weather balloons to check for the weather conditions around the area. And he was up in the island structure, and I was down in the engine room. And,
yeah, the island structure is that part the only part that's goes
the little island structure where the admiral and all of the they drive the ship, and so we were in that section.
Your technical job was the engine room.
Right, I was down in the engine room, and being he was up there, they allowed me to come up and watch the aircraft being sent off and on, and it was really some experience to see that.
Glad that we're talking about this. You know, there's a quote you can sort of comment on by David Halberstam, wrote a book on the 50s, and he talks about Korea quite a bit. He says, unlike the Vietnam War, in the next decade, Korea did not come back to the American people live and on color. The nation was not yet wired. Like he said, we didn't have 24-hour cable. Korea was so distant, the names of its towns so foreign. The best reporting was done, however, by daily journalists who caught the remarkable drama, heroism, and pathos for a nation that largely didn't care and was not at all sure it wanted to pay attention to such grim news. Any comments you have about that?
Well, they were catching flack because we were there and nobody had heard about it. You know, they wasn't broadcasting enough, and they sent some photographers and journalists over. They came aboard our ship and went down right into the engine room where I was and took our pictures and sent them back to our hometowns where our people could see them. And this was very interesting, and it made a big difference in the what people felt about the war. Here's a guy named Miles Johnson out there turning on valves in the Korean War.
And he's from where in Oklahoma?
And from Oklahoma. Perkins, Oklahoma.
Perkins, Oklahoma.
Yeah.
Okay. You've kept that secret from us for quite a while there. It's interesting, and you moved from Oklahoma to Kansas, so you're truly from the middle of the country. Well, this was interesting because, like I said, Vietnam got so much coverage. World War II has got so much coverage, so many movies. But as Halberstam said, the main coverage of Korea seemed to be MASH, you know, the television show MASH, which wasn't quite that realistic about it all either. But, and you mentioned that in connection with something you want to mention too, as far as the veterans, that this is Veterans Day last week, Thanksgiving coming up this next week, that you guys, when you came back from Korea, that no war was declared and it didn't end in a clean, neat way like World War II. So Vietnam veterans many times express frustration with that.
Right.
But it was fairly similar for you guys too, right?
It was. They wasn't going to make each individual a veteran of foreign wars. They hadn't come up with that idea yet, and they hashed it out. And before I got out, they did pass that through Congress. That
so you're actually saying that the Korean veterans, it was a bit of a dispute or not whether they would qualify.
That action over there would qualify as a foreign war.
Yeah. Well, for the 35,000 Americans who died in Korea, it was certainly something, and that's why I'm glad we're doing this. Just a little bit of reminiscence, because some of these facts, you know, just until you sort of determined to know them, you don't really find out. So, I know you feel that. We were talking to you and I were talking to a Vietnam veteran just before the show, not that long ago, that he was talking about that, how no parades, no victory parades, no drums were beating. That's a common thing, but it was also true in Korea. And yet, this was a real war, and there was some real effort going on over there. Well, you wanted to I know you're a pastor in a church, and you wanted to say a prayer for giving thanks for the veterans, for those who fought, because Thanksgiving we're in that season right now, so this is probably about as good a time to do it as we begin to wind up here. So
okay.
you feel free to go ahead
All right.
and say whatever your heart feels like saying.
Okay. Our great Father in heaven, Lord of heaven and earth, thank you for the United States, and thank you for the freedom that we do have. Thank you for our involvement in striving to protect our allies. Thank you for what you are doing through your world leaders. And what we would ask is that the world leaders would want peace, that would be on their mind, and that when they seek to honor you as their God, then you make a covenant with your people, a covenant of life and peace. So as we enter this Thanksgiving season, help us to say a thank you to you for our forefathers that fought to have freedom in this nation. Thank you for that, and thank you for the opportunities that you give us to express this thanks. So we place a lot into your hands, and we thank you for everything. We thank you, and we just say thank you because we are thankful. In Jesus' name, amen.
Amen. Okay, thank you, Miles. I know that we did a show not that long ago talked about some of the young men and women in Iraq as well, so that'll make a nice... thank you for coming and sharing these reminiscences to help us remember a sometimes forgotten war and forgotten warriors. Thank you, students, everybody here in the studio. See you next time on A Second Look. Happy Thanksgiving.